Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we start, I would like to mention some of the housekeeping rules. First of all, this webinar will be recorded and hopefully it will be available very soon after this webinar. Secondly, for the interpretation, you can choose Arabic or English from the language interpretation icon. And then, feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A icon. And also you can use this icon if you face any technical problems to reach out to us as well. That said, we can now start by presenting our speakers. Enrico De Angelis is a researcher specialized in Arab media. His PhD thesis focuses on journalism in Syria before 2011 and until 2016. He conducted the research on the ground in Syria and Egypt on journalism and the network public sphere. He currently works as a freelancer for international organizations such as Free Unlimited, IMS, Deutsche Welle, among others. Enrico is a co-founder of Syria Untold, or in Arabic, Hikaya Man Hakit, and coordinate the Italian page on the French platform, Orient XXI. And we have as well Maria Sadowskaya Komlash, who is a Belarus-born media developer and editor who has spent the last 15 years working on various media-related issues in Europe. Her research interest lies in democracy transition and regulations for media, as well as the phenomenon of exiled media globally. Maria currently works as the lead of Eurasia team at Free Press Unlimited. We have as well two of IMS partners represented by Lina Shawaf, who is the executive director of Radio Rozana. Lina worked as a Syrian journalist for the last 26 years and is a founding member of Arabesque, which is the first private Syrian radio in Syria. She worked as well in the civil society on improving women's rights and human rights through media. She's a certified trainer in the MENA region, and she also won the Freedom of the Press Award from Reporters Without Borders in 2018. We have as well Urwa Khalifa, who is a Syrian journalist, researcher, and editor of the Political Affairs Al Jamhuriya. His educational background is in political science, and he is interested in following social and political transformations inside Syria. This webinar is hosted by International Media Support, IMS, which is an international non-profit organization working in media in countries affected by armed conflict, human insecurity, and political transition. IMS works for free and professional media. Enrico, Maria, Lina, and Urwa, thank you very much for joining us today. I will start with you, Enrico. Personally, the more I read about the topic media in exile, the more uncertain I am actually about this term. So in your opinion, what is media in exile? And should the term exile media prompt definition change in the digital age?
Thank you, Mustafa, for the introduction. Well, I mean, we use this expression in the report, I would say, in order to challenge it, no? I mean, there is nothing wrong with the expression in itself, but let's say it often implies a negative connotation. So it comes often with this image of a group of intellectuals or a specific political group, a defeated political group that is forced into exile, and then they set up this maybe a very traditional magazine, and they use it to talk among themselves, no? So we wanted to challenge this vision, while at the same time to acknowledge the reality that most of the Syrian independent media, and we'll discuss about this definition too, are in exile today. I mean, they moved their operational rooms, like editorial rooms, outside, while they have still networks of reporters inside, of course. So we wanted to point that even if we want to use this expression, we wanted to point that these outlets are still relevant outlets, and that this expression by itself has to be challenged really at the theoretical level. And this for, I would say, mainly two reasons. One is that it's more, has to do with more global kind of technological changes. The fact that today, because of the digital disruption, digital revolution, borders are increasingly blurred. So to be in exile doesn't pose the same limitations that it posed in the past. We know that media practices and media consumption practices are changing everywhere, and sometimes especially in a country like Syria, because there is a very young population, because sometimes electricity is not available, and so on, because, I mean, there are certain specific conditions. But for example, a research that I did with a colleague several years ago about Idlib, we discovered, and we were surprised at the time, how much Syrians there were using actually digital communication devices to get information. A recent audience research, a more extensive audience research conducted by Free Press Unlimited, also confirmed that these media consumption practices are changing, and many people are increasingly using more digital communication devices, and especially, for example, mobile communications, like, of course, through social media, but also messaging applications, in order to get news and knowledge about current affairs also inside Syria. So this is one point, is the fact that even if in certain areas or for certain people, television or radios, FM signal are still more important, but this is changing, and this gap is not as relevant as before. So this is one thing. So this means that media which are based, again, with their editorial rooms outside, can actually reach much more easily the public inside a country. The second element is that these outlets are not founded by diaspora people who were there for years, but they are were founded inside Syria. They were forced later into exile, and they still base their editorial identity on Syrian affairs, and they address Syrian publics and audiences inside Syria too. So this, also in this aspect, the distinction between exiled media and the media inside the country is much more blurred than before. They have networks, again, of journalists inside. They focus mainly on audiences inside, without forgetting, of course, that Syria, also in this, is a specific case. So you have millions of Syria who are living in neighboring countries, especially Lebanon and Turkey, also Jordan, and in Europe. So these are also part of Syria. So the point is, even if these are exiled media, they are, for us, part of a Syrian media system, and they participate in the media diet of Syrians everywhere. So this kind of distinction is, I mean, the main question for me would be, is better to invest on these media, even if we label them as media in exile, but that can produce a fair professional journalism, also because they are not inside the country, or outlets which are today based inside the country, but is, a post-war and authoritarian country where professional journalism can't be produced, while exile media, they can access quite easily also audiences inside Syria. So this is, I mean, while sticking to this expression, we wanted really to challenge it during in the report we wrote.
Thank you, Enrico. Before I move to the next question, my colleague reminded me I was like so excited, so I didn't introduce myself. My name is Mustafa Hayed, and I am the senior advisor for the Syria program in IMS. And also behind the scene, there are my colleagues, Rune and Lilas, who are helping with monitoring the Q&A. And also I have with me Nine and Maggie from the communication unit who are helping with the technical support. So Enrico, you mentioned many times during your contribution to the definition about the characteristics and the relevance. So in your opinion, what are the main characteristics and relevance of the independent Syrian media now?
I mean, it's not easy to give a general description, because it's a very, as I hope I will describe, a very rich and diverse environment. I would say, I mean, there are some elements that tend to share, and also that distinguish them, in my opinion, in our opinion, from other cases. I mean, the Syrian independent media, this media system, I think it represents quite an unprecedented case in the history of exile media or independent media under authoritarian rule. The first one, I would say, is the fact that how they were born, in which context. These media outlets, again, were not founded by groups of just dissident groups in under authoritarian rule, and they went in exile. They were part of a specific political agenda. They came out of a huge uprising or revolution that was not only a political movement, it was primarily or also a cultural and social movement. We have Syrian a society, a big part of a society that couldn't express itself during decades, because it was a very repressive political system that suddenly started to express itself. At all the levels, civil society, of course, but also art, culture, and so on. So suddenly we had this explosion of cultural production on all the levels, also cinema. I mean, really all over. I mean, in many different forms. And what is even more important is that many voices that started to speak are new voices. It's a new generation of cultural producers. So Syrian independent media, they are situated in this context. They are one of the main phenomena of this cultural revolution. So it's not just that they have a specific political agenda. They are one of the main means through which this society speaks and starts to express itself. And this is quite important because it makes them very diverse and very rich. They have different political perspectives, different geographical focuses. They represent different voices. So this is one element. And again, I think it's part of the relevance that they have. I also think that it's very important to say, I mean, we were looking for a label, no, that would define this phenomenon. And we dedicated an entire paragraph to this. So we were thinking about, you have all these terms like alternative media, grassroots media, independent media, digital media. I mean, you have many different expressions, but we thought that the one that would fit better, would include most of them, would be critical. And critical, I mean, it's a media literature kind of term. It defines the fact that, again, they are not expression of a specific political group, but instead, because they express many instances within Syrian society, they are actually critical of most of the political actors and political agendas that intervene into Syria. And they can be national or local or regional or international, but they are critical towards all of them. And they have, so from the Syrian regime, first of all, of course, but also of many opposition bodies, official opposition and armed groups. They are critical of Islamist groups. They are critical of international actors, from Turkey to Saudi Arabia, from Iran to Hezbollah, Russia, and also even Europe and the US. So this is a very important element, because it enables these media, I think, on the long term, to gain credibility in that kind of direction, and also to offer a viable alternative to the two main big narratives that characterize all, not only Syria, but in general, the Arab world, which are, this false polarization, opposition that reduces all the voices sometimes to this opposition between a secular, which is not really secular, but let's say secular authoritarian regime, and Islamist groups, in particular ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra, Tahrir al-Sham. I mean, all these Islamist armed groups on the other side. These outlets, they represent really other voices that come out of society. And these on the long term can play, I think, a very relevant role into issues like accountability, reconciliation, and many others in the future of Syria. And they give voice to, I think, a large part of the population that doesn't identify with those two main narratives. The third element is that we are not speaking about 2 or 3 content producers only. Even the content production is very, very diversified. First of all, we have very different journalistic styles and again, geographical focuses and so on. But we are speaking about an entire media system, which includes also what we called in the report institutions, so media support organizations. Organizations like the Syrian Journalists Association, like the Female Journalist Network, like the Center for Media and Freedom of Expression, the Syrian Kurdish Journalist Network, the Ethical Charter for Syrian Media, and so on. So this is like these organizations complete each other, and they shape what is, a quite ready media system, which was, in light, of course, was conceived thinking of a transition process, so to be installed into Syria then, replacing a media system which was not able before to produce real, credible journalism. But even today, they cooperate together and they work and they offer, not only content. This is quite an exceptional case in that sense. And that kind of richness and that kind of, like completeness, let's say, has a value that, in our opinion, has to be saved for the future. We have also other organizations that do not produce a very specific content, like the Syrian Archive or the Creative Memory of the Syrian Revolution, that produce important documents to preserve memory or to preserve or for transitional justice and accountability. We have a very, very diverse kind of phenomenon there. And I think this is really the key word, is diversity. It's the fact that it's not just one or two outlets. We're speaking about a wide array of actors which represent different instances and different voices which should be relevant and that are relevant in the present, and they can be even more relevant in the future.
Thanks, Enrico. Before I move to Lina, I would again encourage our audience today, please do not hold back. Just click on the Q&A button and type your question if you have any questions addressed to any of the panelists or general question. Lina, I will just move to you in light of what Enrico just said in terms of the media in exile definition and the characteristics. Do you and Rosanna identify yourselves as media in exile outlet? And why? Why not in that sense? And how does the fact that you are in exile affected the way others identify and perceive you?
شكرا مصطفى. نحن بروزانا لا نوصف أنفسنا.
Thank you, Mustafa. No, actually, we do not characterize ourselves as an exiled media. The content that we work on in Rosanna is always relevant to the inside of Syria. So we don't just sit on our desks behind our computers. We actually have reporters working on the ground all throughout the Syrian territory and the front lines. This makes Rosanna constantly connected to the ground. Of course, conditions have changed vastly since the beginning. The living conditions, the professional conditions of our reporters. All our reporters are citizen journalists. There's no citizen who can work as a journalist inside of Syria. There's no freedom of press anywhere in Syria. But perhaps the hardest place to work in journalism and provide information for an institution like Rosanna, it is the area, the regime-controlled areas. Our reporters in regime-controlled areas can mainly provide written reports. Very rarely they can provide some recordings, but when it comes to image, to picture, to videos, it's really untenable because they fear detention, and it has happened several times that we lost reporters because their identity was relieved and they were caught reporting to us. So we don't describe ourselves as an exiled media institution. We have, of course, a vast audience, but our focus is Syrians inside Syria and Syrians in the neighboring countries. And actually, the majority of Syrians are actually living either in Syria or in neighboring countries. And we know already that Turkey hosts the majority of displaced Syrians. So we really focus on this kind of audience, but we still try to build bridges between Syrians inside and outside. We try to find the common ground between Syrians. Of course, Syrians have vastly different concerns, especially when it comes to the inside-outside divide, but there are common concerns between all Syrians. We strive to find that. We consider ourselves a community-based media. This is an identity that we believe is suited for us. We think that any development for a better, towards a better Syria should start from the community. Thank you, Lina. I will ask the same question to you, Arwa. would you describe yourselves in Al Jumhuriya as an exiled media? And why? And how would that description impact you? How would that impact your editorial policy and the way you are perceived by your audience? Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you, everyone, for this webinar. I think we are exiled journalists. We are rather individuals who were exiled from Syria, but Al Jumhuriya as a website, its editorial policy, we are just Syrians. And we also focus on Syria and Syrians in Syria and around in the neighboring countries because most of the events take place actually there. Of course, it does leave an impact on us that we live outside of the country, and it impacts how people perceive us. But I don't think it is that essential when it comes to the production of the journalistic material. I think the post-revolution Syrian journalism did not really concern itself with the question of inside-outside Syria because so many other questions were posed by the last decade. For example, in Al Jumhuriya, we established an editorial line concerned with the diaspora, the socioeconomic conditions of Syrians living outside of Syria, whether in Europe or Turkey or anywhere. But we still consider ourselves a Syrian website, focusing its attention mainly on Syrians inside of Syria. Thank you, Arwa. I'd like to go back to Lina. You mentioned how you interact with the audience, and you said it's mainly based in the region. How do you interact with the audience and make sure that you are addressing their priorities? And how do you maintain their engagement? And they're not just listeners to you, but they're also engaged participants. Actually, since we started Rozana in 2013, we try not to address our audience. We try to speak to the audience. This is very important. We developed over time, and we found many ways to make sure that our audience is not only receiving information, but they're also involved and engaged. They comment, they provide their opinions, they also provide information. We conceived of a new policy where we start a small research whenever we embark on a new project. We try to find exactly what our expected audience needs to hear, what they need to say, what they need to express. This is a new policy that we adopted recently. But what we also try to do, networking with our partners in the civil society, is focusing on cases that are self-expressive. For example, when there's a woman telling her stories about specific harassment or sexual misconduct, we make sure that she is to find an audience that hears and engages. So we create a kind of role model. And this is something that the Syrian civil society is really helpful with. We feel that our audience is with us and they participate with us of course, we have an open mic policy. We don't have red lines. We allow our listeners to contribute. Of course, we don't shut them down, but we also follow the ethical charts of the Syrian media. But we, of course, strive to engage our audience all the time. Thank you, Lina. I'm happy that I'm speaking in Arabic because I would like to encourage our attendants. You can always ask questions from the Q&A icon, and we will, of course, forward these questions to our participants and panelists.
The research on IMS website, it's available in both Arabic and English. So Enrico, speaking about the report or the research, it's been roughly a year now since the time of the research. So in your opinion, how has the Syrian media sector settled in terms of the trends outlined in this report?
Well, I think later, of course, we can ask also Lina and Orwa on this. But I think, I mean, the main trends are there. So we said that the sector was at crossroads, and I think that we are still in that situation. So where it's their future is like at stake, and some of the outlets that we analyzed in the report, and they saw their funding cut, for example, and they were trying to survive. They couldn't, they were like trying to relaunch them even through a period of voluntary work. And of course, this for longer periods doesn't work. I think that the surviving media actors are increasingly able to consolidate themselves in many different directions with their own skills and their own identities. So in that sense, I think there are many positive elements that are happening, and we can think that they will become, for example, more sustainable in the next future, even if, and here it has always been stressed, that because of their specific situation, because of being in exile, to use this expression, and Syria, we know what's the situation is there. It's very difficult to pretend from them that it will become economically fully sustainable out of commercial revenues or other kind of revenues. So the funding will still be like a main element of survival, even in the, let's say, short, mid-term element. I think there are also another element is the reinforcement of collaborations between these outlets that in the past was more difficult, and now that there are fewer of them and they're more consolidated, they are managing to cooperate more with each other. And these, I mean, not only among Syrian outlets, but also at the regional level, also with other international outlets. So I think this is also something that continued and improved from the last 2 years. But as I was saying, the main trends remain, I think, the ones that we identified in the report. And what is at stake is still there. So it's the point is that, of course, for them to survive, they still need support. And without that support, others will also be forced to close. And again, for me, it's a pity because, I mean, many of them already closed, and I think that this richness and diversity I mentioned before would be, of course, negatively affected if other outlets, even today, would be forced to close. So yeah, I think that this crossroad situation and this kind of period, that crucial period to see what they will become in the future and how they will shape also the future of Syria, because I think they can play a relevant role in that sense. It has to be decided, in the next couple of years, for example.
Yeah, we will speak later on the topic and also the point related to the future of Syria. But before that, and speaking of the cruciality, I will come back to you, Maria. In the report, you point to the challenges of exile media to sustain their operations, particularly over long periods of time. So how can donors fund worthily exile media for longer stretches of time, rather than forcing them into a persistent circle of fundraising?
Well, thank you very much, Mustafa, for asking this question. And before I answer to the point, I would like to also refer to some things that were said before. I was really happy to hear and a little bit amused when Lina said we're not an exiled media because we have reporters on the ground and we focus on Syrians. The reality globally is, for the last 20 to 25 years, that all the media that we consider exiled actually do have reporters on the grounds, from dozens to hundreds in some cases, and they all actually target first and foremost the audiences in the countries of exile. The old understanding of exiled media being some voices sitting in some very faraway country and imagining something about what's going on about their country of exile, it's really old. And it's very reassuring to hear the same approach from the Syrian media, many to which we spoke, that indeed being audience-centric and having people on the ground able to bring you news and verify the news is key. And this actually builds the bridge to the question that you asked, Mustafa. So how is it possible that these projects that, as Enrique said, still have to be very much dependent, unfortunately, on the donor funding due to the price factor? How can they sustain that? There are two parts of that. I'll speak about donor policies a bit later, but the first and foremost part is that those media who succeeded to have prolonged donor support globally, like Burmese media before the changes, Zimbabwean, Belarusian, Russian media, some others, they all had something in common, although coming from very diverse political, geographical, and cultural backgrounds. They were constantly thinking how to improve their feedback from the audience, their engagement with the audience, and their footprint and impact on the communities they work with. Although it seems that the commercial world and the donor-funded world are two separate worlds, actually, when it comes to proving that you really have an impact on people that you decided to target, doesn't matter if it's a niche outlet for women in rural areas, or if it's more or less like a public mission outlet that tries to target everyone. But if you can prove that your impact on the audience grows and that you do make changes, even on micro level, the level of one village local council deciding something, the level of someone getting crucial medical aid they were waiting for, the level of some changes into intercultural or inter-community dialogue, the high chances you have for your project to be interested to so-called invest in. The donors, same as commercial entities, investors, they also want to see the return on their investment of the taxpayers' money. But this return is not in the commercial revenues. This return is measured in the ability to bring up real change. The change will always be limited because media cannot replace civil society, political parties, and other actors, but there is the change that media can bring about. When it comes to donor side, as we mentioned in our study, and this has not changed, the donors normally do not have very long-term programs of media support in general. Most of them don't even have specifically defined programs of media support. The support to media globally is usually placed in one of the three pots: good governance, fragile states, or conflict and post-conflict societies. And very much depending on where your media outlet is being perceived right now, the exiled media, including Syrian media, receive their funding. Most probably right now, of course, conflict and post-conflict, then probably fragile states, and only if and when there is a genuine attempt of democratic change in Syria, then it will be good governance. Therefore, there is no single approach, and very rarely you would have to hear someone, I commit to you for 15 or 20 years or 25 years, because of course, everyone tries to plan in 2, 3, 4 years perspective. But that doesn't mean that this support is not happening. Actually, the most successful exiled media who managed to make impact around the world before the changes happened or still happening in their countries had been supported sometimes for 15 to 20 years. So that was possible only because those media grew their capacity, first to demonstrate their impact on the audiences, but secondly, to approach and persuade the ever-changing donor markets with people who have spent 4 years somewhere and then are moved, with changing policies and navigators. And the international media community support has been very instrumental in that. What we could do, I think it should go again beyond Syrian context, although of course Syrian exiled or emerging media market is very, very specific. I think it is up to us, international NGOs, together with local partners globally, with media outlets globally, to push for our governments to recognize that media development is in general a long-term process. You can't have results after 2 or 3 years, and you can't have results sometimes even after 5 years when you work in the very, very fragile or drastic conditions, and to basically reshape the global discussions on how media should be treated. And it should be less about where they're now geographically positioned or where they're fragile or they're not fragile state, and more about their impact to do public service, to do public good, and to help the audiences that they target.
Thanks, Maria. Speaking of funding, we received a question from the audience related to this topic. So the question is are there any promising examples of increased financial sustainability media organizations through commercialization, crowdfunding, or other means?
Yes, yes and no. I mean, it depends on how the media is set up and what is the context. One of the exiled media for Azerbaijan, which is one of the difficult countries in the Eastern European region and Caucasus, has actually crowdfunded 40,000 euro to set up through the diaspora when they started their online TV. But later they never were able to actually repeat the experiment. That was a one-time investment. Another media outlet actually decided to set up abroad, and it considers itself exiled, Medusa for Russia, but it started immediately as a commercial entity in their minds. They had 60 people in the commercial department and 40 editors and journalists looking for all the possible ways of the monetization, native advertising and so on. But you need a market for that. Russia is, or until recently, has still been a market where an advertiser would agree to advertise with an exiled media outlet. That's not a reality for so many media outlets that are there working from abroad. That there are also a mixture models, for example, the Tehran Bureau, that project run by, which always wanted to be called a global project and not an exiled media outlet, run by foreign-based Iranian journalists, partnered with The Guardian for quite a long time and received some of the investment through this partnership by delivering some quality content to them and getting investments in return. So there are opportunities, but yet for anything that would be really sustainable, you also have to face this moral dilemma. Who are the people who will, for example, crowdfund for you? If these are people who are based inside the country that you target, then as an exiled media outlet, usually you're targeting the country that is either at war or in economic crisis, political crisis, with very little paying capacity of people, right? And then you're also asking them to please help us. It's possible, but probably will not allow you to sustain yourself for long. If you want to base your support on diasporas, which have moved abroad for a long time, and they have quite good money sometimes, including, for example, for many Iranian media, then the question is whether what you do targets their interests informationally. And very often you would have to run two separate projects for people inside your country of exile and to please the diaspora, which has totally different information agenda in many cases already because they have assimilated, accumulated. And then it has been very challenging actually for exiled media to please both. Maybe right now in the Syrian context, because so many people had to move, that would be actually the first example where these borders would be a little bit blurred.
Thank you, Maria. I will move now to Arwa. عروة قبل ما أسألك سؤالي بدي أرجع أشجع اللي عم يسمعونا اليوم لحتى تسألونا.
Again, I'd like to encourage all people listening to us, please feel free to click on the Q&A button and address us with your questions. Arwa, so speaking of the context of media in exile, regardless of how you describe yourself, do you have any inspiration? Do you draw inspiration from any of the cases of other kind of media in exile, especially given the fact that you live outside of the area of your audience? Yes, perhaps we look at sustainability from a global perspective rather than through our lens as an exiled media. It is quite a global phenomenon that most media institutions are suffering from financial issues. This applies even to The Guardian, for example. So we don't have, for example, a market for ad revenues. There are some specifics in our situation as Syrians, but it remains a global phenomenon par excellence. Now, we try to seek solutions within the global context. Currently, I don't think there is an alternative to sustained funding from donor organizations. That's the only way we can reach to the audience, to the Syrian audience. We have the case, for example, of Anab Baladi, which tried to crowdsource some of their operations. You can perhaps secure partial funding, and perhaps these experiments can provide partial solutions, but will be relevant to further development of sustainability.
One of the audience believe that you mentioned the potential of digital disruption, especially connected to the younger generation in your report. So can you elaborate a little about this?
Well, yes, I mean, the digital disruption, I think all of us, we know what we're referring to. I mean, simply that today digital media are becoming increasingly important. Most of the websites, for example, consumption happens through also social media, not to go directly to the website. And even in countries like Syria, all these digital devices are very accessible. You know, in the last, I mean, let's say from the 2000s, they became, they started to spread a lot. So this is one of the main elements of what happened at the communication level after 2011, that, Syria became one of the most documented events in history, if not the most documented event in history, no? Because we had suddenly all these digital cameras and smartphones and so on, and everything was then distributed through social media. But I mean, in Syria in particular, I think the fact that the population is quite young, as all in the Arab world in general, so it's they are even more familiar many times with these forms of communication. So when it happens that we have these kind of alternative, small organizations, because we're speaking of small organizations, we shouldn't forget this. It's not on the other side you have Al Jazeera or you have Russia Today, or these are, like in that sense, they are grassroots organizations relying on small funding. But they have this advantage. They can compete much more that they couldn't do in the past. So this is the whole point. And we have all the elements to think that this will happen even more in the next future. So this will increase. People will, and the young generations especially, will keep going more and more on the mobile than on watching the television, like the device of the television. And even during the war, because as I was saying, in some regions where you had electricity cuts and so on, many people were not using the television. It was difficult to follow it and to have it available all day, while you could charge a mobile and use it to get information. So that's what I was referring to. The fact that, again, this makes this specific condition of operating in exile less problematic than it was in the past. And the potential is much bigger than it was in the past.
Maria, I think the discussion around the digital platforms, actually, it moves us somehow between the national and global trends. And in that sense, where do you see the Syrian independent sector is presented with the opportunities and challenges deriving from that global trends?
Well, I'd like to pay attention to two global trends, one pointing to limitations and second for opportunities. So the digital disruption and the development of digital technologies is, of course, the opportunity, but there is also a world trend of decline in media freedom, and especially this trend is noticed in the MENA region, but it's also a global trend, especially now with the Corona year behind us, when so many governments have used the COVID-relating limitations to prevent journalists from access to sources they would normally access, to limit the freedom of movement, to limit even the access to certain data for the whole citizens. So I would not be overly optimistic about how the world looks for any media outlets that want to bring about some changes to the repressive societies in general. And we need to come to think how it is possible, because, for example, if previously your reporters would be able inside the country to travel freely between the region and the other region, who knows, maybe tomorrow they will be stopped, based sometimes on fake pretext of protecting the citizens, right? And this is a very real world problem which cannot very easily be solved with the digital technologies advancement. But of course, you're right. Globally, it's not only the digital technologies are advancing, but especially, and in the MENA region as well, that social media networks or messengers becoming more and more age indifferent. If some years ago, it was mostly young people who engaged there, now there has been a generation, let's say, more generations have added. We also noticed it in the study, and that had only increased. So therefore, basically, this regional trend provides several opportunities for Syrian emerging media. First and foremost, it's much easier now to get your audience-based, to make it more diverse and comprehensive and more representative. right? Because now through the same channels, you don't have to change anything. You have the same channel, your Facebook page, your messengers and so on. You suddenly get access to so many other age groups and people living in so many other places. Secondly, it's also a possibility to get more citizen journalists. Of course, it needs training, but there are also several methods for that. And as Lina was mentioned, right, Rosanna now, for example, relies almost entirely on citizen journalists. Well, you can get more and more citizen journalists in every part of the world that you need to have them. But that also means you would have to invest a lot in training and verification of sources. Again, very often it's possible with the new technologies. Last but not least, of course, this also means that Syrian media who have learned already how to operate in this very difficult condition can become the transmitters of this knowledge to other deprived communities, to other media who are just now facing, for example, this challenge of how to set up the whole media sector in exile. With everyone getting used to webinars, with everyone getting used to some type of online networking and mentoring, as limited as it is. I know that some Syrian media already had this positive experiences in some other countries of Arab world. Now they can actually expand their activities online, and that can become also a revenue source for them because some of that mentorship and expertise can be paid. And last but not least, I think, depending on how well the Syrian emerging media will establish themselves in the countries of their current operations, they can also start serving as hubs or like as safe havens for those journalists and media who would need refuge in the same countries. I think this is a great opportunity because usually every exiled media outlet or sector, when they move to a new country, they have to reinvent the wheel about everything, like legal issues, economic issues, and so on. So I think while, of course, it's a pity that the sector cannot move back so quickly, but it's also an opportunity for Syrian exiled media sector to become a leading force in that.
Thank you, Maria. عروة بدي أسألك بنفس السياق يعني الحديث.
Arwa, I'd like to ask you in the similar vein, really. Of course, when we talk about digital media, we have ample opportunities. Wherever you are, you can reach your audience. But at the same time, we know that on the ground, authoritarian regimes are aware of this challenge and they try to limit this access, the digital access, whether through censorship or blocking websites or whatever control they have over the internet. So how do you deal with these challenges on a day-to-day basis? How do you connect with an audience that cannot maybe open your website or people who cannot open your website, even Facebook page for several reasons? How do you navigate these challenges? I believe Syrians have, over the last 10 years, developed their own tools. There's a consensus among Syrians that all regime-related media are not reliable. So Syrians themselves, the audience themselves, have developed their own tools of accessing information. So when we talk about digital communication, publishing material on the website or on social media, we have adapted to this kind of agreement with the audience that they know how to reach us. Of course, this poses all sorts of challenges. We know that Syrians use VPN services, so this distorts the analytics of our website when it comes to the geography of our audience. For example, But after 10 years, we have faith in the audience, and we know that most of these blocks that the regime is trying to erect between media institutions and their audiences are not. I think social media is a very important bridge because it is not censored by the government. So they're really vital. And they secure a portion of our communication with the audience. But again, we are talking about a skilled audience. So we're satisfied. We don't really have concerns over our reach. But as I said, we have other challenges relating to our ability to analyze the audience. Okay, Arwa, I don't want to really be disconcerting or make you less satisfied about this reality, but given our own communications with other partners, we know that there are operational challenges and all sorts of challenges that have to do with capacity building and training. And we also know, we hear a lot about political money. For example, other institutions that provide better legal and financial benefits compared with smaller organizations or small to medium sized organizations. How do you navigate such challenges, whether operational or the political money or the benefits that you cannot provide for your workforce? That's true, actually, when it comes to the capacity that we have. Of course, when it comes to competition with Gulf-funded institutions, maybe they spend more money in 1 month than what we spend over a year. So, of course, the technical capacity of highly funded and politically funded institutions is really a challenge for us. But still, I think there's still room for independent media. The audience themselves, my personal impression is that there are some media bubbles that the audience is aware of, and people have bias towards more alternative or independent sources of information. I don't think there's a definite solution, and that's why we try to focus on our personnel inside of Syria. Al Jamhuriya always conducts training. We did the Al Jamhuriya Fellowship for young writers. Now we are part of the Arab journalism, the Counter Academy for Arab Journalism, that involves even people from the region. I think constant connection with young writers and promising talents, that's something Al Jamhuriya can afford. It's allowing people a platform to express themselves, sometimes writing for the first time. I'm not sure if I can use the word compensate. We can compensate for this this problem of personnel shortage. I don't think there is a definite solution, but our experience as Syrians tells us that political money is creating media bubbles, and these bubbles will eventually pop. There are very few organizations that sustain themselves over time. There are no final solutions, but there are some manageable solutions. Lena, I have the same question.
كمان حدا من مستمعينا اليوم. What the biggest challenge of your operational setup are today? And do you think that media in exile considered inefficient as media platforms?
يعني هذا سؤال كتير فعلا منطقي اللي احنا بنعاني منه بشغلنا اليومي لأنه
This is a very good question. We suffer from that a lot. Despite all the improvement in the technology, we still suffer from this issue. We cannot keep up with, we cannot remain updated. There are always emerging media outlets, and the audience is also changing. I think a key solution is to keep to stay connected to the audience, conducting focus groups or doing some research, audience research, so that you can know about your audience and where they go. For example, 85% of Rosanna audience use their mobile phones to reach us. So this gives you a hint on how you can frame or produce your content. The other question, which has to do with how of course, we're an independent institution, and we strive to keep that independence in order to address all Syrians and address all the diversity within the Syrian society. So we try to keep our professional standards high. We don't have to be neutral. I don't think neutrality works, but we need to be professional. This is the better suited terminology. Professional media work. But people inside Syria are under unique kind of pressure. So it's really hard for people inside to keep their independence. They have pressure from the different kind of powers on the ground, but these are all stories that we try to learn from and convert into media stories. Well, now we have to talk about the future, but now we received one question. If you can answer it, we just received this question. Do you think that the new generation, those born after 2000, do you think they use the same technology? And are you aware of the changing trends of platforms and ways of accessing the information? Yes, as I said, we try to keep up to be updated. But as I said, you have to know your audience and their relationship with your content. For example, we know that Syrians use Facebook extensively. So almost all their news come from Facebook. So it is your duty, your function, your role as a media institution to reach your audience through this means. Most of the audience of our audience are young people, but as I said, more research, more focus groups, more connection with the audience will be most useful in this case.
Thank you everyone for asking the questions. We encourage you to ask more, but also I think we will not be able to answer all these questions, so we are sorry in advance. So I will start asking these questions that are coming to us from our audience. And maybe we can take a minute or two for each question, because I would like to dedicate the last 15 minutes for the role in the future. So we have a question now for Maria. How can we counter the challenges of social media companies trying to limit conflict content, not ads friendly, on their platforms, as we saw YouTube limiting the publishing or deleting videos, and Facebook limiting the reach of many Syrian independent media outlets' pages? The second part of this question is that how possible is it to lobby social media companies to support independent local media organizations? So if you can limit your answer into, I would say like 2 minutes maximum, that would be great.
If I could answer that, I'd be a billionaire now, probably. All the media in the world would want to know this recipe of how to influence social media platform to help them. But there are two ways to do it from the practice of exile, but also independent media sector. First of all, personal connection matter. If there will be at least one person per your independent media sector with direct access to Facebook headquarters, Google/YouTube headquarters, usually even deleted video get restored. The full 100,000 subscribers on Facebook that have been deleted have been restored for some exiled media. So this is possible. And secondly, this is where it comes to probably more international level. Usually social media platforms follow the money. In Australia recently, they have agreed to certain conditions imposed by Australian government. First, they threatened to withdraw, but then they agreed and say, yes, and we want to prioritize Australian local media when it comes to the local agenda. So if there is a huge monetary element in that, which can be an issue coming from the international community, from the donor government, then that's also a way.
That's brilliant. That was within the 2 minutes. And I will get back to you, and Enrico.
I wanted to add something here. I think the other thing that will be very important, and this is also something related to other issues, and that
I think we have problem with your call quality, Enrico.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Now I was saying also to advocate as a sector on these issues. You know, like there are some common demands and needs that can be addressed by all the Syrian media sector on these issues, and I think that will be much more effective than for a single outlet than to, you know, act alone, and also establishing alliances on the regional and international level on this. So, but one of the, I mean, these are other issues. I think it should be managed in a more, you know, like collective way, not as single outlets, but as a media sector. In these, like the funding and other things.
So I will remain with you, Enrico, because there was a question long time ago being raised by one of our audience. Maybe if you can also elaborate on that in 1 minute. So the question says that what are media in exile? Why are media in exile considered inefficient media platforms? And in your point of view, what are the limits that lead to these conclusions? Maybe in 1 minute.
Again, I don't think they are inefficient in general. I think, on the contrary, they operate under very, very difficult conditions. Again, like they had to adapt to constant changes in Syria, and then for the outside in different countries with different, of course, legal systems, political systems, different kinds of pressures, with the limited funding, with the problem that we were mentioning before, like turnover of staff, because there are competitors that can afford much bigger, higher salaries, and they are more prestigious. So I think that all these elements together make exile media not inefficient. I mean, they have to deal on a daily basis with all these obstacles. And I think that actually these Syrian media in particular, in 8 years, they from scratch, they were able today to produce kind of a good quality journalism and professional journalism with institutions that are working even in these difficult situations. I wouldn't call them inefficient. Again, I think it's an image. They could do better, they could improve, of course, but given the situation, I don't think they were inefficient. I think they were very responsive to many challenges they had to face, and they have to face also today.
So speaking of efficiency, I will ask you, Enrico and Maria, and then feel free to divert this question between yourselves. Is that about the what would be the role of the exile media that it can play in the future of Syria, in your opinion, considering everything that we touched base on today and also the facts that you presented in the research?
Maybe I'd start with the global experience that teaches us, and then Enrico, you'd go into the exceptionalism of Syria. That has been always the debate between us while we were writing. So to look into the future, you need to look into the past in some cases. And if you have not had this past in Syria, you've seen Myanmar until recently, and the whole exiled media sector returning to the country and staying there for 10 years. You've seen Zimbabwe, you've seen some other countries. What we saw the exiled media could do there in the transition period, they became the first to lobby for the legislative changes that would enable free and fair journalism and equal conditions to everyone. They were also able to very quickly apply for broadcasting license or any other license to become home-based broadcasters, which if you would have formed a medium outlet from the scratch would require from you a lot of investment. They also were able to basically start diversifying and opening many media of various profiles based on their one entity that had to be a bit limited when they were in exile. But what many of them still were not able to do for various reasons, we're still speaking about before current Myanmar crisis, for example, is to actually become a competitive media outlet on the scene. Many of them were really trying, but had to shut down or had to really understand that the new authorities still had some state-supported media outlets or oligarch-supported media outlets, and that even if you have been the most popular media outlet back in exile, that doesn't guarantee you staying that when situation changes. But I think this knowledge transfer and important role in the legislation change and setting up new media outlets would be still the main ones.
I have just 1 minute.
No, you can take more than 1 minute because this is our last topic and we have 12 minutes. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, this is of course a very difficult answer because the situation in Syria is very unstable, as you all know, which is in a way positive because otherwise it would mean that we have simply a return back to normal, which is again authoritarian rule. So there are many possible scenarios in the future. First, I think that these media are relevant even today. I think I said why. I mean, they represent a very important third position between these main narratives in which the Arab world sometimes seems to be stuck into, this position doesn't have normally a voice. And I think through this voice passes, the future and the solution, because we can't have authoritarian rule and we can't have extremism. But one feeds the other, and it's, this kind of perverse cycle always repeating itself. So I think that these outlets in particular, they play a role in giving voices to different perspectives on what the future can be, on reimagining the future. There is this lack of imagination sometimes about what can be the future. And I think that these outlets, they propose another view of what the future can be. And so this is relevant even today, even if the numbers are not big. And I think that, again, the media sector in its entirety it's quite actually influential. But also we can't pretend from them, of course, that they are like Al Jazeera or Al Manar or other big mainstream media, and at the same time they produce good quality journalism with a big with a very big audience, and you know, because for these on social media you should just publish cats playing with each other or sensationalist kind of content. No, these media are trying to produce professional, serious, credible journalism, and this, of course, has a cost in terms of not following, you know, sensationalism and so on. But still, they give voice to, I think, very relevant sectors of Syrian society. So they are relevant today, and these sectors of Syrian society can be enlarged in the future, because also consider that there was a polarization, and there is still a polarization, that pushes many people in Syria also to think a bit black and white. You know, this outlet, okay, it's opposition, I shouldn't follow them, you know, even if actually they can agree on the content. Now, this is, we can think that in the next future, this polarization will a bit fade, and we have other, you know, cross lines and possible different, I mean, mixing of people and opinions that before were really on forced to be on different sides. No, so these outlets, I think that will have the possibility to reach more public in the future and to be accepted, you know, by people that before were just labeling them as opposition media, which again they are not. You know, they are not opposition media. This is another expression that we should, you know, really take away. And in that situation, again, there are several scenarios, and I can't go into details now, but they can play a very relevant role in, again, accountability and possible, you know, reconciliation processes, and reimagining, you know, a political scene which will be not what these two main narratives and political groups they want always to enforce on Syrian people. And I think this is the future, if they can survive and if they will be able to exploit that potential.
Thank you, Enrico. لينا وعروة، بعرف إنه لما نحكي عن حديث عن شو دور
and Arwa, I know that when we talk about the future of media in Syria, we cannot ignore the question of funding, which seems to be one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest concerns. And we cannot talk about that role in the future without reference to this question of donor community. So I'll start with Lina. What can the donors do to guarantee the sustainability and the quality of this support provided to the media sector, so that this sector can play its role in Syria's future? First of all, they need to have faith and to have this belief that media, in order to change, needs time. So if they're coming from values of democracy and freedom of expression and freedom of press, they need to be aware that change needs a lot of time. So I'm not saying that we always talk about funds, and it is not everything, but it's still very, very important. You cannot do anything without money. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but it's very important that this money is directed to supporting independent media. But as I said, the time is important. These media outlets require long times. They have been repressed for 45 years, so they need their opportunity to grow and to change their methods and to change. I'm not saying that as an argument for more sustained funding, but really history tells us that all successes in media, all revolutions that succeeded needed a lot of time. So supporting independent media is not something limited to Syria. It's not a support you provide for one sector, but it's also a battle against discourse of hate and extremism. So supporting independent media anywhere, especially in areas of conflict or areas of war, it is a support for all independence of media and not only in Syria. Thank you, Urwa. If you can, in 2 minutes, tell us your take on this question. I think currently and maybe over the past period, most donor institutions design their support based on preconceived concepts like women's support or anti-extremism. So I think donors need to reconsider this mechanism. Media needs sustainability, and they need to focus on the quality of their products and the needs of people themselves, rather than the needs of the donors, which sometimes imposes on their beneficiary institutions an editorial line that is outside of the context. I'm not talking about the examples I mentioned before, but there could be some examples of such dilemmas where I think changing the conditions for support is very vital for the sustainability of such media. We received another question. I think it's directed at the donors. It says there's value placed on the success of media. There's this measurement that has to do with the views and the counts. But sometimes there could be high quality investigative report, for example, that is barely seen. On the other hand, there could be some misinformation or rumors that receive a lot of attention. So do donor institutions take this into consideration? So I will take the opportunity to answer this question. I don't think there is any media institution or media support institutions that has one measurement. Of course, the quality is as important as quantity. And most platforms that spread misinformation or hate speech, I don't think they have good funding compared with other platforms.
Just I will have a last look on the questions.
I will take.
Okay. So I think like now we have 1 minute, so I will have only like, okay, Maria, go ahead, maybe in 20 seconds.
Well, yes, as a donor institution representative, I would say the donors who are used to work with media look at the engagement and really depth of the story and not only clicks. There are many donors who can spoil especially emerging media by just looking at clicks and views. But you as media should think, if my investigation has been watched only by 5 people, what am I doing wrong? Because as a result, you still need to have an impact on the audience. So whatever is the way you can show the impact is crucial.
Okay, now we come to the end of this webinar. It's 2:30. So once more, thank you very much for all of you for joining us today. Maria, Enrico, Lina, and Urwa, we really appreciate your contribution. And also, I extend this thanks also to Biljana, who couldn't make it to be with us today. And also, thank you everyone who are listening to us today for joining us and for your time. I would like to remind you that also, again, that this webinar is hosted by Syria Program in International Media Support. And you can access, read, and download the report that we are talking about on the Syrian exile media by going to IMS website, which is mediasupport.org. You can read it in both Arabic and English, and you can download it. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for my colleagues behind the scene from communication, Nine and Maggie, and also to my colleagues in the Syria program, Lilas and Rone. And I wish you all a nice day. And thanks once more.
Thank you, Mustafa, as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.